If you struggle to get your MIDI instruments to sound real, then this video is going to be for you. Today, I'm going to share 8 different tips that you can use to make your MIDI or software instruments sound instantly better and more realistic. For this video, I'm going to be working in Logic Pro, but the majority of these tips can be applied to any DAW, so don't feel like it's not relevant to you just because it's in a different DAW. I've been composing and producing music for over 10 years now, and as much as I try to mic the actual source, that's not always an option. And so these are some tips and tricks you can apply to your MIDI in-the-box software instruments that really help it to sound realistic and more lifelike. So tip number 1 is to actually play or perform or record the MIDI yourself to whatever you're doing. So if it's drums, try to tap it out on your keyboard or maybe a drum pad if you have it, or piano, try to actually play it, even if you have to take one hand at a time. This is going to give you a wider variety of velocities and timings that help it feel more real. So to show you the difference between programmed and performed drums, I just did a quick 4-bar loop of each one. So this first one here, I programmed all of it. I just dropped in the notes. And then the second one here, I played it on my MIDI keyboard, and this will kind of show you the difference in feel. Granted, the one I played on the MIDI keyboard is not locked in on the timing, and the velocities are kind of a little more dynamic, but that's kind of what's going to make it feel real. So I'll play them here back to back so you can get a difference. So it's going to start with the programmed and then go to the played. It's fine, it sounds like drums. And then this will be the played right here. That's the first tip there, is to actually perform it when you can. If you can't play it for whatever reason, you don't have a MIDI keyboard or anything like that, then some of these tips later on in the video will help, but the absolute best case is to play it yourself because you're going to get that human feel that you're missing. The second tip is to quantize, but don't quantize to 100%. So if you're not familiar with quantizing, it's where you select all of your notes and then it locks them into the grid. By default, quantize is usually set to 16th note and 100% strength. When I performed these, they were kind of all over the place. If you quantize it, select all, hit Q to quantize, it's going to lock them all into the grid, so they're perfectly in time. Quantize strength is basically from 0 to 100%, how much are we quantizing the note? So this is what strength 100 looks like. Everything's locked in on the grid. But if I start to pull strength down, you'll see all of the notes start to drift back towards their original position. So as I pull it down, they start to drift. And then if I go to 0, that's exactly where it was before it was quantized. So I usually like to set it anywhere from 50 to like 90, depending on the amount of tightness I want. But very rarely do I ever put it exactly at 100. The only time I'll put it exactly at 100 is if it's like a synthesizer or some sort of programmed element that needs that very locked in feel. Otherwise, it gets, 50 to 90. And so this is gonna preserve a bit of that human like push and pull and not right on the grid, but it still brings it a lot tighter and closer together. I'll play it not quantized, and then I'll go to 100%, and then I'll put it somewhere in the middle. So here is not quantized at all. Here's 100%. And here is 70. So usually the sweet spot for me is like 70 to 80 because it's mostly quantized, but not quite all the way there. And yeah, it's not perfect, but that's what makes it feel real. I think a lot of people, when they're producing music, they get stuck in like, oh, it needs to be perfect. But a lot of times that just kills the human quality of the music. So I've found the magic in working digitally is somewhere where you get to preserve the human elements of the music, because that's what music is it's people doing things imperfectly. So when you start making it perfect on your laptop or whatever, it loses some of that magic to me. That's my trick with quantizing, is to not put it at 100%. And that works with any instrument, not just drums. And I'll just play around with the strength, because if I want it to feel tighter, put it up closer to 80 or 90, or if I want it to feel really loose and vintage and that kind of thing, I'll pull it back towards like 50 or 60. So that's a good trick to add to your tool belt. So tip number 3, this is a big one. It's to consider how the instrument is actually played. So I was in a band a long time ago, and I would program the drum parts for the drummer and like send it to him and be like, this is what you play. And he's like, I only have 2 hands and a foot. because I'd send him like just all the things. Like here's all the notes I want the drums to play, like toms and cymbals and kick and snare and all this. Drummers only have, 2 hands and a kick and a hi-hat they can click. It's important, like if you want your drums or any instrument to feel real, you need to consider kind of what that instrument is doing. So for example, this is what I've programmed here, the drums, that's a real performance. So the cymbal happens on the right hand, and when the cymbal's happening, I'm not having a hi-hat because, right, the drummer's gonna hit the cymbal, go to the hi-hat, and then that's what that hand does. The other one's playing the snare. So I've programmed here an example of too much on your drum tracks. So like one drummer could not do this. So you have simultaneously 2 crashes. You have a hi-hat that's going the entire time, and it's not a foot click, it's hand on the hi-hat. You have tom fills while that's happening, and then halfway through you have 2 more crashes and a ride that comes in. It's more than one human could play. So I'll play it for you so you can hear, and you might not even hear it and say, oh, that's fake, but I think subconsciously it starts to like, if you hear a real drummer playing, it never sounds like this. So there's like this kind of discrepancy there where your brain subconsciously is upset about it or something. It's just too much. If you want that movement, add something else like a shaker or add, something else. But just something to think about is consider how it's played. Another example of this I see a lot is like piano. So if I add a piano track in here, okay, so there is kind of what a piano player would play. But then if you come back over and add a lead line or something, then you're exceeding the limitations of that instrument. So it sounds great, but it's more than a piano player would play. It's too much. It makes the piano sound too thick. So I would recommend, if you want that kind of sound, maybe put the lead on a Rhodes or a Wurlitzer or something else. Like pick a different keyboard, pick a different instrument and move it over there. Because if you're thinking in a band context or a real instrument context, your keys player is not going to do that. And if you give a keys player that on sheet music, he's going to be upset with you. Tip number 4 is to not loop your regions. So this is okay if you're kind of in the songwriting or the brainstorming phase, but when you're actually kind of producing the song and like, all right, this is the real thing, try not to loop it. Because if you take, especially a loop that you've programmed, so say this drum part right here, the just completely straight, nothing fancy drum part. If you just loop this for your whole song, it's going to start to feel robotic. Whether the listener realizes it or not, it's just going to sound like the same exact thing over and over. So what I would actually recommend is either, if you want to start with a loop and then hit J to join it, it's going to make one loop and then you can go through and program differences. Or better yet, if you are able to perform it, just go ahead and record it. Like record the whole song as a MIDI take. And then that's going to feel different because then you're going to have all those subtleties and differences through the whole performance of that instrument, and it's going to feel real instead of like a drum loop the entire song. I know some songs call for a drum loop, like that's the specific sound, but for the case of this tutorial where it's like getting you real sounding MIDI, that's not going to fly. So just something to think about if you are looping regions or dragging or duplicating. It's okay a little bit, but try your best to add variances or perform it yourself or anything like that you can think of to spice it up and make it different. So tip 5 is to add separate parts for layers. So if you are layering sounds, I've pulled up 2 pads here. I've got this one and then this kind of darker one. So the temptation with layering might be to just like arm them both and go for it. So here's what that would sound like. And that's fine, that's passable, like people do that. But if you really want to sell it and make it feel more full and dynamic, I would pick a different part or range or something for each instrument. Go to your first pad or whatever you're doing and find kind of the range, maybe a couple notes that it sounds the best. That sounds really good right there, so I'm going to track that. And then for the next one, pick different notes. So if you're trying to fill out notes of the chord, you could do this. So I'm gonna roll with that. And now it's a little thinner, but that's actually going to help your arrangement. It's going to add space and create interesting depth and that kind of thing. So here's the first one with both the pads playing the same note. It works. Here is the separate notes. So it just adds this layer of difference and like movement and change. And of course, make sure you're hitting all the notes in the chord and everything you need to with that instrument, but definitely making sure to not just layer on layer on layer, of course, unless that's what you're going for. Just tools that you can use, whether you choose to use them for a particular thing or not. Tip number 6 is the humanize function. You may or may not know about this. I'll show you on this drum track. I'm gonna lock everything to full quantized, full velocity, not full, but somewhere in there. So we basically have just a straight up boring drum part here, right? Programmed, all the same velocity. It's fine. If you highlight them all, hit select all, go to functions, MIDI transform, humanize. What this is gonna do is nudge the start position and the velocity of your notes by a certain amount. So there's a lot going on here. What you wanna look at is this position right here. So this is going to be the start position of the note. And so the more you increase this number, that's measures right there. You're going to want to just do this, the ticks, I believe. The more you increase that, the more difference there's going to be. And then over here on velocity and length, this is also what you want to look at. So this plus minus random right here is saying it's going to either increase or decrease the velocity of each note anywhere by 10. So it could be 10 louder, 10 softer, 2 louder, 5 quieter, whatever. And same thing with length here, that's gonna do the note ending. That's not really helpful for drums, but that's really good on keys or piano or something with sustain. I'm going to push up this random a little bit, maybe to 13. And then you wanna make sure all your notes are selected and then just click operate. So you see once we did that, all of our notes are a little different colors now. They're all kind of nudged. So this is another helpful way to add realism, and I'll play it back for you to hear the difference. It's really subtle, but it definitely does help. I don't like it as much as just performing it though, because you'll notice some random snares are louder than others, or things that should be accented in a drum performance aren't. So that's something to think about. It is helpful. It's a nice tool to add some variety and some interest, but it's not a substitute for playing it like the real thing. So the next tip is to add ghost notes, and this can be applied to any instrument, keyboards, whatever, but it's most noticeable and most impactful on drums. So if you're not familiar with ghost notes, they are super quiet, almost non-existent notes that the drummer plays in between beats and that kind of thing. So if you ever watch a drummer play, a lot of drummers do this, instead of just playing, the actual part, their snare hand especially is going to be moving just a little bit all the time, kind of keeping that pace, that alternating syncopation. It's just not loud. So those are called ghost notes. And good ghost notes will really help sell your MIDI performance. Basically what I would do for ghost notes, and you kind of have to think like a drummer a little bit. So if you're not a drummer, maybe ask a drummer friend or watch some drum tutorials and kind of get the hang of where those ghost notes need to be. But I've found they are alternating with the hi-hats. So if your hi-hat is on the 8th notes, then your ghost notes are going to be on the 16th, opposite of the 8th notes. So I've gone through and put in ghost notes where I think they sound good and where I, as a person who plays drums sometimes, would put ghost notes. So here's what that sounds like. And something you can look for if your drum program has alternate hits or that kind of thing is to put your ghost notes on a different articulation. So what I mean by that, on the Logic Drummer, for example, my main hits are on the snare center. So maybe my ghost notes could be down here on snare edge. So I'm going to grab them all. And this also helps you control all of them separately, because when they're on the same row, you can't easily select them. So go down here and put them on snare edge. And then you can just click snare edge, select all of them, and change your velocity of your ghost notes. So if you really want them like loud, or you can pull it down. And now is when Humanize can come in handy, because I have programmed those in. I found it's easier to do it that way. And then you can Humanize right here and just operate on those guys. And so then it nudges them, changes them up a little bit. That's when Humanize really comes in handy. My final tip for making MIDI sound real is to use the mod wheel. The mod wheel is almost always assigned to some sort of parameter on the instrument. So a few of my favorite uses are on synthesizers. They always have some sort of cutoff or LFO or something associated with the mod wheel. So if you map that in while you're recording your MIDI, it's going to give you much more of a dynamic performance. One of my favorite uses for the mod wheel is when I'm recording strings for cinematic stuff. Usually in string libraries, the mod wheel applies to the intensity or volume of the strings. And this is helpful for programming the swells and dynamic changes of the strings, because I've seen a lot of people, and I was guilty of this when I first started. It's where you just play like full velocity strings the whole time. And that's not what an orchestra does. An orchestra ebbs and flows and gets louder and softer at certain parts. So that's where the mod wheel comes in, is you can actually program these in. And Logic will record that right into the MIDI. If you don't have a mod wheel, I'll show you how you can record that in yourself. So I'll just play something real quick. So here's my strings. If you don't have a mod wheel, you can go into the editor window here. You can click the scissors to get there, or press E on the keyboard and click this little automation thing. Down here is where you pick what you're seeing. So right now it's on note velocity, but if you switch it over to modulation, it's going to be whatever your mod wheel did. And so if you didn't put anything, there won't be anything here. And then you can come through and actually draw parts, draw some ebb and flows. I'm holding down Command to do this because my secondary command thing here is the pencil. And now when I hit play, you're going to hear the strings go up and down with this path here. Into the drums. I hope you enjoyed those 8 tips. If you have any further questions, make sure to reach out down in the comments and I'll be happy to help out. If you'd like to learn more about me and the services I provide, there's a link down in the description to my website, so make sure to check that out. I'm also pleased to announce that I'm now offering one-on-one coaching sessions, so if you'd like to hop on a call and ask specific questions about Logic or your production, I'm happy to help out, and I'll have a link for that down in the description as well. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure you like and subscribe because it really helps to support the channel. Thanks.